see if Bence is available. Nope. Click on it, find out. Nope, and it's available. And see, this is 10 pages. Ooh, and this is pictures. Alright, I want to do the one with pictures. Sorry, we can always go back and do the other one. Drop the volume on this a little bit. But yeah, this is pictures. I like philosophy with pictures, personally. So, here we go. I'm gonna do this here. Oh. Oopsie, there we go. Little bookkeeping. So if you want to grab the link, you can always, there it is. You can always type, if you're here, type !paper, and the link will pop back up. It'll also be in the show notes if you're watching this later in the VOD. And that's what live streamers, for you who don't know, call video on demand. That's the, YouTubes and also the replays that you can watch on Twitch also for while they last. Okay, any other bookkeeping things right now? I don't think so. I was thinking maybe I would do some like, I could post. I haven't quite figured this out yet. But I mean, I could post this page in my, where's my, Phil Roulette, news and updates. So I have a news and updates. Yep, sorry. Oh, I don't have posting privileges. I have to be checked by our support team before I can write posts. Interesting, because I made a, wow, okay. So that's super interesting. They don't want people spamming their news and updates. Huh. Okay, okay. Interesting. So, but that's okay. I wonder, as long as I can click on recommended, that's all that really matters at this point, and I can click on it. So, okay, we'll see. You know, maybe have to see what happens when if they can grant me posting rights. Anyway, let's dig into some Bence Nanay. I forget how to say it. Nanay, whatever. I apologize to everyone how I say their names. Anywho, so my first time reading it. Feel free to ask questions, and we're off. Look at figure 1. Okay. Figure 1. What is seen? This looks like it's a window of some sort of multi-story building, because this doesn't look like a ground floor. Looks like we're looking through, I don't know how yeah, like, there we go. So this is not all of it, I don't think, but like, I don't know if you guys can see. Yeah, this is mostly all of it for folks out there. You can see that maybe this is O-E-J-I backwards, or O-E something. Or maybe, or is it I-T backwards E-O? So it looks like these are something. Are they numbers? Or like maybe they're old numbers? I'm not sure what. So we're looking through a wet pane of glass at the top of what looks like a somewhat ornate, so it's a little older building. I don't know my architecture. But yeah, so you can see that, well, this is what we were supposed to look at. Okay, so we looked at it. Alright, now we look away. We did that. Do something else and try to remember the image. Okay, so think about purple monkeys, and then think about the figure 1 we just looked at. What will you recall is more similar to figure 2? Alright, so what's figure 2? So this is figure 1, and this is figure 2. That's interesting because it looks basically the same to me, but it looks like maybe there's some space on the left and right, and maybe the top and the bottom. It looks like you've got sort of a wider view, if I had to guess. Like, and it looks less wet on the edges too, so it looks like it's drier over here. Yeah, it definitely, is it wider? Yeah, it looks like a little bit zoomed out. Okay, so they're telling me what I will recall is more similar to 2. I mean, I don't know that, but that's what they're saying. Okay. When we remember a scene, we remember more than what we saw, literally more. The scene's boundaries are wider than the boundaries of the scene we saw. This phenomenon is called boundary extension. Boundary extension is one of the most robust psychological findings about memory. It holds across age groups, experimental methods, drawing from memory versus picking a picture that matches our memory, length of exposure time, how long we are looking at the scene, length of time gap between seeing the scene and recollecting it, depictive style, photo versus drawings, image content, and so on. And so you can go see Hubbard et al. For a very thorough summary of these findings, and Bainbridge and Baker for some recent findings that complicate this picture somewhat. So it looks like it's mostly what people think, but like some people still have doubts. So it's like you'd have to see what these two, B and B, have to say versus Hubbard et al. In the philosophy of memory, boundary extension is used as an example of the constructive nature of memory. This fits into a wider set of findings about memory that all seem to demonstrate that memory formation is not a matter of copying perception into our memory. Memories are rather constructed on the basis of the scene we see, but their content is not determined by the scene seen. Scene. Yeah, I wonder if he did that on purpose or not. This raises an important philosophical question about the boundary extension findings. Is boundary extension explained by perceptual adjustment or by adjustment during memory encoding? Again, when you look at figure 1 is the stimulus. On the basis of this, you have a perceptual experience. Later, you recollect what you saw, and this leads to a memory of image 2. On the face of it, there are 2 possible ways this can happen. This is one again. According to the first way, boundary extension is a form of adjustment during memory encoding. This stimulus of figure 1 leads to a perceptual experience of figure 1 just like it should. Perception is veridical. I'm always like, what the hell does this mean? Like, perception tells the truth? Well, perception is what we perceive, so in that case, I mean, it is what is perceived. The adjustment happens when figure 1 is encoded in memory. The memory encodes figure 2 rather than figure 1. As Kirk and Kirk and Michaelian, the representation of the scene is modified automatically as a memory of the scene is formed. According to 2, in contrast, boundary extension is a form of perceptual adjustment. There is no adjustment during memory encoding. The perceptual experience of figure 2 leads to the memory of figure 2. But when we look at figure 1, we experience figure 2. The reason for this might be that we look at figure 1, we supplement the stimulus with our own perceptual schema, and this leads to the experience of figure 2. So we have a perceptual schema that is like in addition to our perception, which then makes us expand upon the image. Okay, that's one theory. My aim is to propose a third explanatory scheme according to which the extended boundary of the original scene is represented by means of mental imagery. And given the similarities between perception and mental imagery, the memory system encodes both the part of the scene that is represented perceptually and the part of the scene that is represented by means of mental imagery. This means that the boundary extension is neither perceptual adjustment nor memory adjustment. Yeah, see, this is the thing. It's like, I think what the author here is saying is that perception is not inherently just like true. It's that what we see is also littered with parts of our interpretation, and that means that what we are remembering is what we actually experience, but what we actually experience is not the actual world. It's part perception, part and what they're saying is not this additional thing, but it's in some sense very Kantian, sort of like we're seeing the world through our concepts, and that means the mental imagery is playing an active role in our perception as we are doing it. So it's not a supplement later. It's that this is how we see, is via these sort of not exactly true things. They're part concept, part perception. Okay, I see where we're going, Kantian folks. The two-step model of boundary extension. My claim is that boundary extension is a two-step process, and we have plenty of empirical evidence for how both of these steps work. I propose the following scheme instead of 1 and 2 above. 3. Stimulus, the figure, perceptual experience of the figure, mixed perception imagery experience is figure 2, and memory is figure 2. So I guess the thing that only our eyes are doing, that like it doesn't really, what they mean by experience here? Because what I thought they were saying is that the perception imagery experience is fundamental. And so there is no perceptual experience. There might be perception, like the light hitting our eyes is part of our perception, but I don't know if that's an experience that we experience. Well, we'll just have to see what the author means by this. The first step is that looking at a picture activates early cortical representations of the space immediately outside the boundaries of the picture. Note that this is a different and much weaker claim than the perceptualist explanation that we do have perceptual experience of the space beyond the picture's boundaries, but this space is nonetheless represented by the visual system. Okay, so this is I think what this just said is that our brain is allocating enough memory to hold the whole picture, and in doing so it sort of does more, it gives you a little bit more space. So like the cortical representations of the space immediately outside the boundaries of the picture, so we're sort of like projecting that we need to have that space just in case, kind of like maybe looking through a window, you're expecting that if you move left and right you can see the edges, and so maybe that's kind of what our brains are doing when we're looking at a picture, is that we actually are, like the minor adjustment abilities are still there. So they're expecting that even though the picture doesn't have that. Okay, take a modal completion as an analogy. We know that if we look at a circle partly occluded by one of the corners of a larger rectangle, our visual system completes the occluded part of the circle. This can lead to a strong quasi-perceptual experience of the occluded part of the circle, but what matters from our point of view is that there is a vast amount of evidence that the occluded part of the circle is represented by direction-sensitive neurons in the early visual cortices, even in the primary visual cortex. So while on the retina the occluded contour is not present, our visual system draws on this occluded contour already in the primary visual cortex. Okay, like this, like if anyone didn't know what that meant, was it's like one of these dealies. It's like if you have one of these, where am I? Okay, I'm over here. Like a triangle. Oh, let's see. That was terrible. Let's do this first. Circle. And then we got like a triangle behind it. I'm sorry about my thing. But like now you can imagine I erase the oopsie. Do I have an eraser here? I don't even know. Yeah, I gotta practice with this thing. Alright, let's not do that. But like you can imagine if this part here is let's see, wait. Actually. Oh, that moves it. Oh my god, that was crazy. Okay. But yeah, you can imagine that like if the middle circle's there, you still see the triangle behind it. My apologies for my dorky ability here, but that's the thing, like you can imagine that there's a triangle behind that like circular crap, and that's all that's going on here. So your brain fills in what's expecting to what's being occluded, like what's being blocked off by something else. Your brain sort of tries to make up for it and find some space there. So yeah, let's get rid of this. It's not helpful after this one little bit. So author says, I am not suggesting that we amodally complete the scene beyond the boundaries of the picture. Depending on how we define amodal completion, this may or may not be true. If we define amodal completion as the representation of occluded parts of perceived objects, then amodal completion is out of the question, as nothing occludes the part of the scene just outside the picture's boundaries. What is important from our point of view is that the early visual cortices represent the missing parts of the scene that fall just beyond the picture of the boundary. Yeah, I mean, sure, there is nothing that falls outside that, but it makes more sense like if we were treating this like there's a window right behind my setup. So like when I do this, like I'm literally just looking at different parts of the world that I couldn't see. When I'm sitting here, I would go here, I can see farther over there, and then like when I look at this side, I can like look around the corner right over there. And so it's like we're more used to looking through windows than we are looking at pictures. And so in some sense we're expecting to be able to do that. And our brain, they're saying, is basically prepped to be able to look around the corner of things that are blocking our view. Just as the amodal completion of the occluded objects is not perception per se, the early cortical representation of the parts of the scene just outside the picture boundaries is not perception per se either. It is the kind of representation that is produced by perceptual processing, again perceptual processing in the early visual cortices, without direct sensory stimulation. Psychologists and neuroscientists have a simpler way of referring to the kind of representation that is produced by perceptual processing in the early sensory cortices without direct sensory stimulation. They call it mental imagery. Here is a representative quotation from a recent review article in the leading cognitive science journal Trends in Cognitive Sciences. Quote, "We use the term mental imagery to refer to representations of sensory information without a direct external stimulus." End quote. Okay, I mean, that's what they say, but what does that exactly come down to? Author says, "I will borrow this way of using the term mental imagery in what follows, but I do so merely for convenience because saying representation that is produced by perceptual processing in the early sensory cortices without direct sensory stimulation is somewhat cumbersome. To put the point briefly, when we see a picture, we have mental imagery in the sense used here of the scene just outside the boundaries of the picture." Okay, so like the brain is trying to like fill in the gaps, like it's expecting to be able to look around the corner. Most of the time this mental imagery is unattended, but it can also be attended, especially in some examples of visual art where the artist very explicitly tries to evoke our mental imagery of the scene outside the frame. One famous example would be Degas, who likes to place the protagonists of his painting in a way that only parts of them are inside the frame. The rest we need to complete by means of mental imagery. In some extreme cases, for example, dancers climbing the stairs in the Musée d'Orsay. Let's see, can we pull that up fast? Would help if I could spell. Oh, it's this yeah, so here we go. You can see they're coming up from the stairs right here underneath. Well, this is not the best. Let's see if we can get a slightly better one. This is not any bigger. This one's okay. None of them are that big. This one looks like the biggest one. Okay, so you can see that there's people coming up from like the below on this sort of left side of the screen. You can see all the people over here on the right. You can mostly see them, but they're kind of blocking them. But you can see that there's like two people walking up the stairs right here. So that's like, yeah, I guess that's what Degas is a little bit up to. We only see someone's arm on the top of her head, and we need to complete those parts of her body that are outside the frames by means of mental imagery. Yeah, so the people on the lower left, you have to realize that they're people, not just disembodied heads. Another example is Buster Keaton, who also uses the viewer's mental imagery of the off-screen space in his films, but normally for comical effects. One example is the first shot of his short film Cops, 1922, where we see the protagonist in close-up behind bars and looking depressed. The second shot reveals that he is behind an iron gate, talking to a girl who does not love him back. Okay, so yeah, you have to, like, everyone out there looking at me, I am not a disembodied head. I have a body, like, underneath this. Like, I mean, this is a paragraph. What was really the point of this paragraph, except for, like, referencing some, like, art that the author likes, but I mean, is this really so hard? We are very, very used to seeing this sort of thing on like TV nowadays. It's not very complicated, but yeah. Okay. To sum up, the first step of the boundary extension process is that we represent the scene just outside the boundaries of the picture by means of mental imagery. In other words, looking at figure 1 leads to a hybrid perception imagery representation of figure 2, where the parts closer to the edges, basically the difference between figure 2 and figure 1, are represented by mental imagery. This is the first step. So basically what's saying is that the borders, you are looking at the borders of things, and you are trying to put together a little bit more information about the scene. And so when it hits your memory, that little bit of extra information is still there. The second step takes us from this hybrid perception imagery representation of figure 2 to the memory of figure 2. And just as in the case of the first step, we have plenty of independent empirical evidence about how this step works. We know that the perceptual system is prone to treat perception and imagery similarly. In the Perky experiment, one of the most famous and earliest experiments about mental imagery, subjects are looking at a white wall and are asked to visualize objects while keeping their eyes open. Unbeknownst to them, barely visible images of the visualized objects are projected on the wall, which they take themselves to be visualizing, not perceiving. Perky 1910. Oh, that's fun. That's a nice old experiment. So their perceptual system treated the perceived images as mental imagery. So that's fun. Like, they projected stuff and they told them to imagine it, but then they actually projected it too. And then so people couldn't tell the difference. Okay. Remember that I used the term mental imagery here the way psychologists and neuroscientists use it, as representation that is produced by perceptual processing in the early sensory cortices without direct sensory stimulation. Both perception and mental imagery then amount to representation that is produced by perceptual processing in the early sensory cortices. The only difference between them is that the mental imagery is not triggered by direct sensory stimulation. Yes. There seems to be more going on here, because you have to sort of have the right sort of understanding of the scene already to know what sort of things to add to the scene to like when you see me, you're expecting a human body underneath this. You're not expecting an alien or a fish body or something weird. I don't know what you're actually thinking. I am made up of, but you have to you already have the concept. So there's something else to this. So the only difference between them is that the mental imagery is not triggered by sensory stimulation. No, it seems like there is some sort of processing though, and so it seems like there might be more than the only difference. To go back to the Modal Completion example for a second, if you look at the landscape through a mosquito net, strictly speaking, you perceive little squares of the landscape, and you represent parts of the landscape that are between these little squares that are occluded by the net itself by means of Modal Completion. This nonetheless gives rise to a unified visual experience. Yeah, so I'm looking through a window and I know there's dust on the window, right here. I can see it if I look at the window, but then if I look through the window, sometimes I ignore the dust. So then I can see the tree over there. But again, if they're saying that something is filled in, there is definitely some sort of interpretation that's going on, and it's not just that the mental imagery that something's firing. It's firing in a very specific way to fill in tree stuff, whereas in the pictures here you're filling in building stuff. So I'm not sure that about this one thing right here where they say the only difference is that the mental imagery is not triggered by direct sensory stimulation. It seems like it's triggered by some secondary system to talk about occluded stuff, but then that occluded stuff has to be relevant to what is going on, and that relevancy here is what I'm a little concerned about, because it seems like that's not getting mentioned. The memory system takes the hybrid perception imagery representation of the scene and transforms it wholesale into memory, regardless of what part of the representation was imagery and what part was perception. It transforms the hybrid perception imagery representation of figure 2 into a memory of figure 2. Last reference to a modal completion. When we look at the landscape through the mosquito net, we later recall not only the little squares we actually perceive, but the landscape that is the hybrid of amodality completed parts and perceived parts. Yeah, so I mean, I can think about the tree without thinking about the dust. Best of both worlds. In this section, I will argue that this two-step explanation of boundary extension combines the explanatory benefit of the perceptual and the memory account, and it does so without inheriting their problems. As we have seen, the most influential version of the perceptual account of boundary extension is the perceptual schema account. One of the most important objections to this account comes from the experiments that show that boundary extension is also present for scenes with no recognizable objects. So our perceptual system is not in a position to apply a perceptual schema to the scene outside of the boundaries on the basis of recognized objects inside the boundaries, for the simple reason that there are no recognized or even recognizable objects inside the boundaries. So only random dots, for example. For similar reasons involving semantically inconsistent scenes. Yeah. Our brain's going to try to make sense of stuff, even if it's not recognizable, if it's like some sort of pattern, or even if there's no pattern, we try to find a pattern a lot of times. So it's not just perceptual schema in the sense that we had ideas about it. We will do more than that. We will try to figure it out. While these are clearly difficulties for the perceptual schema account, they pose no problem for my account, as the early cortical representations of the scene behind the boundaries of the picture are not necessarily formed in response to top-down information about the specific objects inside the frame, which would amount to a perceptual schema. They could be based solely on the geometrical features of the pattern inside the frame. Okay, so there doesn't need to be... Well, that's weird. Why is geometrical features not a top-down thing? Like, can we recognize certain shapes in a non-reflective way? Maybe. But I mean, there's a limit to that, and especially if you're going to start saying that we can see building features that are on the, like we start putting in building features, that's different from geometrical features. Like architectural details are not just geometrical features, they are architectural. There is definitely more to it than that. So it seems like there is lots of information, and so it seems, this is the problem, there is a difference between, I don't know if I buy this anymore because I like the setup, but the geometrical features are definitely not architectural features. Architectural features can be made up of geometrical features, but if you are actually remembering what they say, the difference between a architectural scene and then you remember like a wider view of the architectural scene, it's not like you had random geometric features on the outside of that geometrical scene. You have the architectural features. So that does seem like some sort of top-down thing, because you're not going to be able to process architectural features without some sort of top-down reflection. Okay, but maybe we have to grant that maybe our brains do have some sort of fill in the gaps thing that is not reflective. And I buy that. Like, we do fill in the gaps, but that's not reflective. But like, is it top down? Maybe not. Maybe there's some like in between thing where we just react to things we've seen before with more of the similar stuff. So if we've seen buildings like this, maybe we can just fill in some of the architectural details based on some sort of reflexive understanding of those features. Maybe. But yeah, like this is what I said right here. This is I think a big point, and I don't know if it's been argued very well. Okay, another consideration that militates against the perceptual account comes from subjects with bilateral hippocampal damage, which is a memory disorder. These subjects show much less boundary extension than controls. This seems to suggest that boundary extension has to do with memory, not perception, as memory impairment has a significant influence on it. Note, however, that the hippocampus has a well-demonstrated influence on mental imagery, again on representations that are produced by perceptual processing in the early sensory cortices without direct sensory stimulation. In other words, my explanatory scheme predicts that bilateral hippocampal damage would interfere with boundary extension. Okay, that's fine. Finally, proponents of the memory account often dismiss the perceptual view on the basis of fMRI findings of Park et al. 2007, which could be taken to show that the early visual cortices are not involved in boundary extension. It is important to point out that the Park et al. Findings do not in fact show that the early visual cortices are not involved in boundary extension, something the authors of the study later themselves explicitly acknowledge. Further, more recent fMRI experiments on how the visual cortices behave in boundary extension, see these people, show that the early visual cortices are very much involved in boundary extension, just as my account predicts. So much for anti-perceptual considerations. But the memory account of boundary extension also has been argued to be inconsistent with some empirical findings. Okay. While the emotional content of pictures does not seem to have an effect on boundary extension in general, for highly anxious subjects, negative arousal, and only negative arousal, does have a consistent effect towards less boundary extension. One way of explaining this is that the attention of these subjects is engaged with the central part of the picture, with where the emotional content is, and this takes attention away from the boundaries. So they're saying if you have tunnel vision, you don't get boundary extension. More generally, it has been found that if our visual attention is engaged elsewhere, this influences boundary extension. Okay, so there is a focus question. So if you're looking at the boundary of if something has a boundary, but you are ignoring it, then that has you have some active control over where your attention goes. Even if you're looking at a scene, sometimes you're not looking at all of it. That seems fair enough. Attention is a perceptual phenomenon, so this seems to be a point for the perceptual account and a point against the memory account. Yeah, but attention's really hard topic, so I don't know how much you can put on that. Note, however, that my account can explain these findings in a straightforward manner. Mental imagery is as sensitive to the allocation of attention as sensory stimulation-driven perception. So, if our attention is engaged elsewhere, this has consequences for the details of the mental imagery of the scene just outside the boundaries of this picture. So, my account can explain the effects of attention on boundary extension as much as the perceptual account can. Excuse me. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, it's like you can focus narrowly on a scene, and then I guess by ignoring it, you can sort of get your brain to not do those other things. Yeah. Question of focus and how that stuff works, but no one knows how that works, but it does happen, so it's fine. Alright, objections and some empirical supports. We're almost done with this paper too. It's a good warm-up. We have seen that my account is not vulnerable to the widespread objections to the perceptual and the memory accounts, but there is an objection that could be raised directly about my explanatory scheme. See Goetzmann and Intraop. Explicitly imagining the scene outside the frame does not increase boundary extension. Experimenters ask the subject to imagine what the photographer would see if she zoomed out, or to imagine the smells and sounds coming from outside the frame. One might think that this is a problem for my account, but it needs to be pointed out that mental imagery, again by which I mean representation that is produced by perceptual processes in the early sensory cortices without direct sensory stimulation, is very different from voluntary and intended acts of imagination. Imagination may or may not presuppose the exercise of mental imagery, but even if it does, it is a very specific way of using mental imagery, which is very different from the automatic involuntary formation of mental imagery outside the boundaries of the picture. Yeah, I mean, saying imagine what's over there, which I can't see because that's there's a wall this way. Even though there's a window here, there's a wall there. If I know what's over there, I've seen that area of the world before from this angle too. If I go like this, I could, but it's night now, so I actually can't see anything. But the idea that there's some sort of process that does this doesn't mean that process will be affected by us imagining it, and that's fine. Okay, continuing. On the other hand, some empirical findings seem to support my account. First, the most consistent way of canceling out boundary extension is by making the frame extremely salient. It is not clear why the prominence of the frame should influence the perceptual schema or the way the scene is encoded in memory, but we can explain this effect in terms of the mental imagery of the scene outside the boundaries of the picture in a much more straightforward manner, as the salience of the frame works against the early cortical representations of the scene just outside the boundaries of the picture. Why? That doesn't... I mean, this is just the author declaring this. This is not an argument at all. Like, what are you doing? I can imagine why that would be so. So, like, if the window frame is painted, like, very plain white. If it was painted, like, hot pink or something, that would, take my attention away from, like, the window and move it into the whole, like, scene with that thing. Then the boundaries of that scene would actually be on the outside of the window frame, and that is, like, actually some more windows, but, like, that would be the walls, if you could imagine. And so it's like, instead of looking at what's inside the window, which would prompt you to look at the to think about what's you're seeing outside, it would prompt you to think about the wall itself and not outside. So that would make sense if the frame ceases to be a frame anymore, basically. So that would make some sense if you moved your attention wider than what the picture you were looking at to the whole wall that included the picture. But in that case, again, then it would sort of take away from, like, looking at it as if it was a window. Oh, what is that? Okay. Oh, yeah. I've got a fan going because it's hot in here and starting to rattle. Okay. Finally, boundary extension can be induced haptically. This seems very difficult for both the perceptual and the memory account. See if I can. Sorry about that. I don't know if you could hear it, but, like, it was very loud in here, actually. Finally, the boundary extension can be induced haptically. This seems very difficult for both the perceptual and the memory account to explain. On the other hand, given the vast amount of research on the visual mental imagery of non-cortically blind people, and also the research on haptically induced multimodal visual imagery, where the sensory stimulation in the haptic sense modality triggers mental imagery in the visual scene sense modally, this finding is exactly what my account would predict, as multimodal mental imagery, including the haptically triggered visual imagery of blind people, is triggered in a similarly automatic and involuntary manner as the mental imagery involved in representing the scene just out the boundaries of the picture. So, I mean, haptic feedback is like hand-based feedback. So, like, if I touch this, and, like, you ask me what's on the other side of it, like, I can kind of, like, imagine. And so I guess basically, like, if you were, like, reaching through, like, a window or something, like, I'm reaching out to you right there, and, like, I was like, well, and I could feel something on the other side, you could say, well, what else is there? And your brain is trying to fill in what else is in this. So, like this thing is... Let's see if I can show you in any reasonable way. So this is a circular pop filter, which basically keeps me from spiking the sound on air going out. But, like, if you ask me what shape this is, I can only basically feel half of it at a time. My hand's just like, I could go the whole thing. But this is saying that, like, look, your hand will basically assume, like, that by touching, like, part of it, your hand sort of induces you to make you think that the rest of it is a circle. And so this is a perceptual, like, it's inherently perceptual for people. Even if you can't see, we still do this, which is kind of interesting. All right, let's finish up this short paper and maybe move on to something else. Conclusion. I argue that boundary extension is not explained either by perceptual adjustments or adjustments in memory encoding. It is, in contrast, explained by the perfectly natural and understandable use of mental imagery to complete the parts of the scene just outside the boundaries of the picture, and the equally natural and understandable transferring of the resulting hybrid perception imagery representation to memory. Okay, this seems like I've read stuff by Bence Nanay before. It's good stuff. A little bit of science, a little bit of mind theory and perception theory. I didn't love this argument up here, which is the big defense against the first difficulty. What exactly is doing the filling in? And how do we actually fill this stuff in? Because it looks like if you were filling in architectural details, there is no way in hell, like, ancient people had any concept of, whatever this sort of architecture was. And so it seems like we have to have some sort of high-level understanding of seeing a lot of this and then filling it in. Now, can we fill in maybe geometric shapes? Sure. But does that fill in the borders here? Because that's what we're saying, that you're filling in all these borders with multiple architectural details. I don't know. So, what exactly is doing this work? Is it conscious reflection? No. But it also isn't just something that is happening after the fact either. And I think that's probably right. Perception is a mixture of the direct stimulus and some sort of our conceptual processing, and then reflection gets something afterwards, and who knows what that actually we get, but like there's a lot going on even on the input side. And so the question is, they could be based solely on geometrical features. Nah, that makes no sense. But what else could they be? I'm not sure either. And so that's a good question. All right. Anyone have any questions on this paper? Now here's the question. Now here's the new thing. The new thing. Does this paper get a recommendation on fill papers from me? Do I go back to over here? Not this. Of course, you can see these people that are cut off and you can fill that in. But do I click the recommend button on the Bence Nanay work? I don't know. If anyone wants to vote out there, I'm thinking no. This is a nice paper, but like basically, it's not a whole lot happened in this. It did a few nice things, but I don't think this is like it's good. It's good, but is it gonna get like a super nice one? No. Maybe I'll get like a like. So this is the question: I'll give it a like, give it a recommend, or should I just hit the bookmark? I'm just going to hit the bookmark for now. Alright. And cool. So now I've got a bookmark. I've never done this before. I mean, I've done that on my like personal account, but I'm doing it on like the Phil Roulette account, so I don't know exactly how I'm going to work this out. But yeah. Like, recommend, bookmark. So like if it's really good, I'll hit recommend. I don't know how much the like button does, but like the like button does show up as publicly. And then you can make some public bookmarks. I still haven't figured out where the public bookmarks are. Like you can have lists, like public lists. But yeah, we'll see. Okay, anywho. Oh wait, you can't even see that. Yeah, so sorry about that. The like, recommend, and bookmark here. These buttons. Okay, but that was fine.